Allan, thank you so much for coming to help teach about grant writing. I was calculating a rough estimate of how many hours you and I have taught this subject together, and it's over 2,000 in 20 years.
Well, thanks, Anne. That's more than I would have thought.
I know. Give or take. Yeah, so we've done this together for a long time. So what I was hoping is we could have a conversation to share some of those lessons we've learned and things we've covered with many mentees. So let's start first about getting ready to write a grant. How do we help people prepare to be ready to write?
There's no magic formula, at least I don't think there is. But really it has to do with your preparation and your stage of career. If we're talking about people in a medical setting, then really you say, who's ready to write a grant? Well, if you haven't published any papers, you're not ready to write a grant. If you haven't had advanced training in your clinical area, you're not ready to write a grant. If you haven't had training in the science that underpins your grant, you're not ready. So if you turn it around and say, okay, I'm an individual who, let's say, is a clinician, a physician, and I've done my residency and I've done my fellowship, and I've gotten a couple papers out of the work that I did in my fellowship, and now I'm starting my job as a junior faculty member, you're probably ready to write a grant. Now the question is, which grant?
Which grant? Okay, but let me take you back to this hypothetical person. Yeah. Supposing that this person is, has a long-standing interest in research, and they published a couple of papers as an undergrad with some lab. Is that paper good enough to help them get ready to write a grant?
It might be. For example, if I worked in some lab and I was working on some variant of RNA that has to do with a certain disease, and now I've finished my clinical training and I want to do that same thing, you might be ready, except for the fact that it's been 7 or 9 years since the last time you worked with this RNA. And at the pace that fields are progressing, no way on this day you can start. Now that's not to say you couldn't rapidly get up to speed, publish a paper today about what's going on in that field. But really it would be, a couple papers from the distant past aren't enough. Really what you want to demonstrate is now I've had success and I'm ready to do more.
Mm-hmm. When you and I take people into our training program for clinical and outcomes researchers, we're really looking at people generally writing to a career development award, a mentored research training grant, and they're usually pretty substantial, coming out of a federal funder or a major philanthropic funder, usually 5 years. And you and I are looking for some recent publications, ideally on the subject you'd like to study, ideally with the keywords of the grant you're going to study, and even better, co-authored with one or more of your mentoring team. Is that right?
Well, the stronger the foundation, the better the building. You brought up a couple of issues. To receive let's say a federal career development grant that's 5 years, that's more than $1 million, they're not going to give it to you unless they are confident that you are someone who's going to move forward and have success. And so what if you're looking at it from the reviewer's perspective, success breeds success. So if you're an individual who's, let's say, come out of a fellowship and has a couple papers in that area, really, again, I view it as building the edifice of your research career. And so often your first move is not the career development grant. Often the first move is, by the way, the local version of your specialty society has a grant, or your university has some type of pilot grant, which is often your first move on grant writing to say, okay, which then helps you because, oh, someone has thought your work is worthwhile. Someone has thought you're doing good stuff. And then that means the next grant, oh, well, we already know so-and-so has done well, right? Because this agency or this foundation or this university gave them the grant. And again, if you think the career development grant itself is not the end, right? Because the whole point of getting a career development grant is so that you are ready to get independent, large-scale research funding afterwards. And so, your whole trajectory needs to be, here are the building blocks. Here are papers on this topic. Here are small grants on this topic. Here's a mentorship team that I've worked with the goal that, let's say at the end of a career development grant, now it's obvious that you are the one to get the large independent R01 level grant because you have built the foundation.
Okay, so thank you. So that brings me to want to discuss more specifically, should an early career investigator go after small-time pilot grants, $1,000, $5,000, $10,000, even though the 5-year career development grant looks pretty generous, 5 years, 75% salary support. Who should be chasing those pilot grants?
As with most things, there's like good and bad with these smaller grants. What's good is, again, it's the way you build a track record of success, that I got a small grant, did well with that, then I got a bigger grant, and then I got a bigger grant. Now, more than one person has been a little sad getting the $10,000 one-year grant, and when they realize that they can't get it done in 1 year, and that there's much more work than they proposed. But really, again, the individual who is either in an advanced stage of a fellowship or is just starting their career as a junior faculty member, they ought to be on the lookout for these types of grants, not only just at the start, but even later on, because take a typical NIH-K grant, career development grant. The amount of money you get to actually do the research is relatively small. Maybe it's $25,000 a year or $50,000 if you're lucky, which really, for most health services or outcomes research, it is not that much. I can maybe hire part of a data analyst or part of a research assistant. So in the long run, you are going to need additional funding. Now, again, $5,000 grant might not do the job, but again, success breeds success. And if you can get the small grant and do it and accomplish it and have a tangible product.
Well, that's the big if, yeah?
Yeah.
This is where we see sometimes, once in a while, somebody gets a pilot grant that's way too ambitious, and they shouldn't have proposed it and the funder shouldn't have funded it, but they got it, and it looks like a great vote of confidence, except they can't get the stinking thing done, so they don't have the outcome to report. They can't have the product of scholarship. And then they're sort of explaining, they want to say, I got this big grant on this date. Except it's still in data collection. I don't have a paper yet. And it goes from a real potential positive to what could be viewed as a potential negative.
Well,
so we have to take great care and make sure that's highly, highly feasible and accomplished. It is one of the best things you can do, and you have to actually complete it.
Well, and that's where there's a certain amount of tension, because what I can accomplish in 1 year may seem small, right? But it has to be right-sized for the time you have, the support that's part of the grant. And again, no one likes it if there's no tangible products from your work. So, you have it in the context of a grant. Where is the paper or papers that are the product of that? But even take one step back. sure, I presented an abstract from that grant at some meeting, people are going to say, well, now it's 3 years later, where is the paper, right? And, so tangible products of your work, I think, are critical because if you, again, think in the career development context, if I'm a funder or a reviewer, I want to know that this person can deliver. That really, it's not just good ideas, because ideas are not a dime a dozen. Good ideas are more than a dime. They cost a little bit more. But ideas without follow through are not going to get you further along.
Right. You might get one grant, but it will be very hard to do it again.
Right.
And that's the game here, right? We're trying to build the capacity and the track record to build an externally funded research career that lets you do it as part of your day job.
Right.
We're not interested in hobby science.
Right.
We like to say if you're not getting paid, it's a hobby. So most people don't need more hobbies, right? Okay, so you also bring up something I'd like to talk about, which is sort of the submission strategies or the timelines, because you're an early career researcher, you're scouring the postings for opportunities. Everything always seems to be, it's sort of when it rains, it pours, right? There's something that might be due in February, something in May, and then maybe something in June. So what's your experience watching people work towards multiple grants at the same time? What do you recommend?
It could be done, but it's mostly it's a bad idea because you're diffusing your energy. You have only so much sort of psychic energy to devote to this. Anyone who has done grants knows that the work is not done when you have the 12-page narrative or the 6-page narrative, that there is so much more with it. And all of it has to be done at a certain date. It has to be at grants and contracts at a certain date. And really it's possible if let's say I have one grant that's due in February and there's another grant due in June. It's possible if the second grant is really an extension or a variation of the first grant. But everyone who says, oh, well, really, it's no big deal, just change the biosketches a little bit, it's never no big deal to write a second grant. And so it can be self-defeating to write too many at once, because again, there's only so much energy to go around. Mm-hmm. And if you're dividing the energy into little pieces, there may not be enough to get any of the grants as good as they could be.
I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think we've seen this too many times. People just working themselves to the bone, and actually it's all worse for the lack of focus. And let's talk about, suppose there are these 3 potential options or 2 options. What are some of the considerations for people to pick which one? I know some people would say, oh, I'm going to go for the biggest budget one, but maybe you're not fully prepared with the track record. You don't have the pilot data, you don't have the perfect mentors, or something more prestigious or something easier to get. How do you help people pick which one to do and which one to let go?
There's no 100% answer that applies to everyone. I think, you can strategize about which grant I have the better chance of getting, but all grants are going to be competitive. So there's no grant, I won't say no. It's rare that there's a grant that it's a guarantee that you're going to get it. So that's always a bit of a risk. On one level, it depends on where you are in terms of this analogy of the foundation that I used before. So to the extent that I have several papers exactly in a target area where the grant you're talking about is the next logical step, not a step that jumps too far, But the next logical step, then you say, okay, maybe go for the larger grant. Certainly, I have run into situations where people pulled back from writing a larger grant, only to find out later on that the smaller grant they got was probably too small to do the work. And then they look at who got the larger grant and they ask themselves, my grant could have been bigger and is better than the one who got the larger grant. So there's always a bit of strategy on that. But as if I'm starting, it's kind of, I would view it this way. If the first grant I got is $10,000, well, the second grant is not going to be a $1 million grant. It's unlikely that you can make that jump. Now, it might mean the second grant is 30 or 50,000, or maybe even 100,000. Again, it really is a function of what is needed to take the science the next step. Most grant agencies are I shouldn't say agencies, but reviewers are fundamentally conservative in their views of grants. In that they want innovation, they want new ideas, that's great. But they don't want ideas that are too new or too far out there. And so that's where, again, thinking of what's the logical progression of the work that I'm doing. And I've often told people who are in this mode of building a career that they should have 6 or 7 or 8 specific aims. Okay, and maybe the $10,000 grant is aim 1. The $50,000 grant is maybe aims 2 and 3, or maybe just aim 2, depending on the magnitude of it. And it's the next grant that might have aims 3, 4, and 5, and then the one after that. And we've definitely had examples of people who have taken their area and thought about it that way, that there's really a sequence of studies, some of that might be in a serial mode, one right after another. Some could be done in parallel. But really, they've thought about the problem deeply enough to know that there are many aspects to this problem that need to be dealt with. And they are going to work systematically. And of course, if you're a reviewer and you see someone, they have this paper, that paper, that paper, they got a small grant, they got a paper from that. This is a bigger grant that's taking the next logical step. You're going to rate feasibility way higher because it's logical. There's been success, and so again, how to judge it? There's no set answer. I won't say, but although I would say. Scientific societies or specialty societies often are a good way to go, in that they'll have young investigator grants. And so if you're in that zone, that might be a good move for your next grant after the small one.
Right, because they like to invest in their own people, their own members, that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. Our next section of the course is about specific aims in particular. And yet you're using the great wisdom of 8 aims, 10 aims to start building out your career. And I think we've also seen, not every aim's going to pan out, or it could spin happily into multiple outbound studies. And I think not only do we encourage people taking this course to think about not 1, 2, or 3 aims, but 10 aims. And also think of the branching logic. If this study comes to fruition and you have a positive product of scholarship, what additional ways could it go? Because things don't always work out, and or sometimes things pay off really big, right? We've seen that with perhaps subpopulation studies or adaptations to different populations. Maybe you do something on transitions of care from the child to the adult system, and there's some future series of aims that could go fully pediatric or could go fully adult, to give one simple example.
Well, you're exactly right. It's fine to do what I said, to have this sequence, but any study that's any good is going to raise new questions, right? The new ideas are going to come out of the findings from it. And those ideas may lead to a path that's sort of directly related to it, or it may push you in a totally different direction. And so you have to be open to that, because what I said earlier is probably too prescriptive to really believe that 10 years from now I'm going to be doing aim number 10.
Unlikely.
is unlikely, just because you're going to find new things, the field is going to move forward. And so you always have to be open to new ideas, but again, it's really common for questions to come up that need answering, right? Yes. From this first study or the second study that may or may not be exactly on the line. And of course, then that's a choice. How you can't go after every question, right? Most of the time, what's the rule? The rule is you're allowed 2 areas of scientific focus. You're not allowed 3 areas of scientific focus. Now that's perhaps too
It's a simplification. Right. Maybe the 3rd area would be a methods area, perhaps. Yes, but only because there's only so many hours in the day to do this work.
Well, right, and to the extent, as we talked about earlier, I have 3 areas of focus. Well, you only have so much energy. What are you going to do? 1/3, 1/3, 1/3? Are you really going to do as well on the thing that's your primary area if you are spending all the time on something else? Now, to the extent you brought up the idea of a method, if I develop a method to approach a given larger problem, then that might be easily applicable to other domains. Because you brought up, pediatric to adult transition. Well, what about transitions on the adult side, right? As I leave the hospital or leave the emergency room or whatever, you can imagine the concepts that come out of one might flow to another one.
Yes, and that's also where I think we would think, as you were saying, it depends on the person, depends on their training. For a PhD, full-time researcher, one of my earliest mentors said 3 is the magic number. Literally, a third is the perfect sort of chunking of projects, basically meaning, wouldn't it be great if you had 2 at 50%, but that's not usually how it goes, and that you want the biggest chunks possible so you don't get sort of death by 1,000 cuts on a number of projects where you're 5%, 10%, you can't get anything done. For a clinician who has a major clinical practice, that's a thing, that's real, and probably you could handle 2 more chunks, so to speak. So anyway, those are rules of thumb. People do it differently. Now, on timelines, I think we would say sooner is better. And to your point, if you're just tweaking something or you're resubmitting it with a different twist, okay. Just more time is better. What I like to encourage people to do, and it's a goal, it doesn't always work out this way. I personally hate rushing. I hate feeling pressured by a deadline. So I often work way in advance just to avoid that. And yet some wonderful people really get focused by that looming deadline. And so they tend to push it to the end. That's a decision about how to work with other people. But, what I do think everybody benefits from on grant writing is you have a draft and you have enough time before it's due that you can set it aside while you're doing this other front matter. You're writing the letters, you're filling out the forms, you're doing the thing long enough So when you come back to it, it almost looks like somebody else's writing, and you see it with fresh eyes and you go, what? Why did I say it that way? I need to change it. But if it's just so fresh and you're literally editing days before the submission, that you can't do that. But it often is a wonderful opportunity if you can, right? Do you have any other tips that way?
Well, for a larger grant, 6 months is not too long to be thinking about. Now, luckily in the NIH world, you sort of know when big grants are due, that they're, February, June, October. So it does give you a bit of ability to plan for that. But for a larger grant, really, you do need a lot of time, because you need time for yourself to let it percolate on a subconscious level. But you also need to make sure that you give people on your team and not on your team time to look at it and get back to you. Because you may have, let's say it's a career development grant and you have a mentorship team. Most mentors are going to be busy, right? And so you have to give them time to be able to read it and give you useful feedback. But it's also important to give it to people who are not part of your group. Because, again, one thing that I have perceived with having worked with our scholars over the years is getting it so that a smart individual who doesn't know your field understands it. If you can achieve that, most of the time that means you're going to get funded, because that means it's clear, that means the points are straightforward, that they understand what you're doing, they understand why you're doing it, and they understand how you're doing it. And so, you can impose on your partner, your friends, and you probably should if it's a big grant. But you have to give them a little bit of time as well to go after it. So a big grant, 6 months. Now, the other thing that I would say related to this multiple grant question is, I think people make a mistake if they go what I would call chasing grants. Okay, meaning, oh, this thing came out, it's not really exactly in my area, but I could move over here and do that. And most of the time that doesn't work for the young investigator. Again, because you're going, for the young investigator, you're trying to tell a story. I am interested in this scientific problem. I have started by doing this. I've gotten the small grant. Now I'm going for the bigger grant. So that to the extent you go this way, again, feasibility starts dropping, right? Or the perceived feasibility of doing it starts dropping. And again, it's a diffusion of effort kind of thing. And so, just because there's a request for something that's sort of in your area, I would be careful about making the choice to go after it, because sometimes that's a mistake and it actually harms you rather than helps you.
That's great advice, of course. The other thing we talk about is don't submit a grant you don't want, because that will be the one that gets funded, darn it. And we call that the winner's curse, right? So don't be persuaded or bullied or pressured into pivoting just because there's funding. There's other ways to strategize about protecting your research time from writing a grant that you don't want, especially early career, when any small perturbation away from your core interest could take you completely down a path that you didn't want.
Yeah, well, and sometimes what happens is, in a given department, you as a bright young investigator who's got some skills that learned in training, oh, you're the one who could write this grant for us, right? And one has to be careful, because you do want your superiors to like you and value your work. But saying yes to that too much can really lead to compromising your own ability to move forward. So,
yes, I will share not the whole story, but an abbreviated version of a story where I was in a group in my early career, and one of the investigators came and said, "You have this skill. Could you just please help me write this grant? This will be so great. It'll help me." And I thought, oh, shoot, I guess I should help them. I'm trying to be a team player. I do not want to do this project, but I feel sure that my boss and mentor would want me to do this. And certainly there I went reporting back to my chief that this is what I was working on. And he said, well, why are you doing that? And I said, well, they asked me to, they really needed my help. I thought you would want me to do this. And he said, no, that's not what I want. I never told you to do that. I want you to be totally clear on the career you are plotting out and to ruthlessly protect your time to advance these goals. And so I kind of failed that test, but I didn't fail it twice. So I do think you have to know what you're doing. And of course, people will ask you to do things and they'll respect you if you say no, professionally and kindly, and they see that you are very dedicated and focused on your own research goals.
Yeah, just on a topic that's related to what you just said, although not totally related to grant writing, it is critical that you have a clear understanding of what your boss has as expectations for you. Because we ought, and I don't know so much on the PhD side, but on the clinician side, it is very easy to be extremely busy. I do my clinical work, they want me on this committee, they want me to do this. And, at the end of several years, one goes to talk to the boss and the boss says, well, that's all fine and good, but I really wanted you to do this research, and where do you stand on that? And you say, well, I haven't really made much progress because of that. And so you want a close concordance between the work you're doing, it's like a Venn diagram, the work you're doing and what your superiors want you to do, so that there's not an unpleasant surprise down the road.
Yes, and the easiest way to find out what that is to ask. Right? Shocking. It's okay. People want to know, they are happy to tell you what they would like to happen. And in truth, they'll, especially as you say in a clinical practice, if you're off doing some funded project, somebody's covering the patients. So you do want to be a good colleague and acknowledge, show gratitude, offer opportunities for your clinical partners to participate in things from time to time when it makes sense, because really you're both doing what is your highest specialized use. If you're recruited to be an early career researcher moving towards independence, that's what your chair wants you to do. He or she will leave it to you to navigate the schedule and to navigate your group. But they absolutely expect you to stick to the plan. And so you have to be your own best advocate, right? And yet sometimes you can call on your mentors to play the bad guy from time to time, raising the important questions. What's going on here? What did we all agree to? But it's your career, so you have to protect it.
Yeah, it's exactly right. And that's, one interesting question is about who should be my mentors. Sometimes there's a little challenge if the mentor is basically the boss, because the bosses of a unit have many responsibilities and they want you to succeed. No two ways about that. But their other responsibilities sometimes may influence their recommendations for you. And that's just the way it is. And so you do have to
navigate.
Navigate.
Yes, I agree. I would say, when you're more senior, the stakes are lower at kind of getting tangled up with a mentor who's your supervisor. When you're early career, that can be tricky. I would say we would put a premium on finding somebody who's not your boss. No, that's a great point. Allan, let's talk about getting your grant scored, and everybody hopes for a magical score that gets funded the first time, but most people, it's a revise and resubmit. Could be called a rejection, but basically not yet grade. So let's talk a little bit about how do people navigate that? It can be really disheartening, especially when people work for, as you recommend, 6 months to put together a major proposal, and either they get a mediocre score or shocking, a score that means they don't get discussed. How should people respond?
Well, there's how people should respond and how they do respond, and I'll only speak for myself. The challenge is, how personally do you take the rejection? So to the extent you take the rejection as kryptonite, like Superman, you are in deep, deep trouble, because again, you've put a tremendous amount of your own psychic energy into this, so it's hard not to take it personally. But to the extent you do that, it really compromises your ability to move forward, because one spends too much time or too much psychic energy thinking about, oh, I guess it's me. I guess I'm not good enough. I'm not smart enough to be able to do this. And I think it's okay to have a short period of kind of sadness about it, because it is sad that one's put a lot of effort into it and one didn't get funded. But one's got to take that emotion and put it to the side, and really take the perspective, okay, the people who read this grant have given me feedback. I don't like that they didn't go for the grant, but those are smart individuals who took the time to read my work and looked at it critically and identified some things that need to be fixed. And if you can sort of make the psychic switch that, oh, wait a second, this is going to help me now. I've had my period of sadness, I'm done, but now I need to look at what these reviewers had to say about why they thought there was such and such a problem with it. You've got to reframe it, in effect, to say, wait a second, they are going to help me on the next time around. And it is true. The reality for certainly federal grants at pretty much any level, it's very uncommon for people to get it on the first attempt. And so that means from a mindset point of view, you probably need to go into it with, I probably will have to reapply.
Right. Or will it be 1 or 2 resubmissions? The modal number is not 0. Right. Right.
Yeah, and so if you can go into the initial grant with that mindset, knowing that I may have to resubmit or am likely to have to resubmit, it might be a little bit less, painful. Now, the other thing is, people who are successful in research, at least my perception, are relentless. Okay, and their interest in their problem is very, very strong. And their motivation to work on their scientific problem is strong. And so, sure, I got a review that didn't give me the funding. I don't actually care, because I need to answer this scientific question. I will take what I can learn from the reviews, I will make it better, but I must answer this scientific question. It's not that I kind of want to or sort of would be interested. I must answer it. And if you must answer it, then you will not let the disappointment of a rejection stop you.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, part of getting older and wiser is you've been rejected so darn many times. You just realize that, you give yourself less and less time in the, sort of anger, mad at the world, mad at the reviewer, mad at yourself, and you're ready to move forward quicker. The other thing that helped, often I I find, you read the reviews and you're just furious. And you think, how could this reviewer get this so wrong? They say, this was unclear. You say, what are you talking about? It was totally clear. Okay, it wasn't clear to them. Fine. But you're not in a place where you can be curious about really what were they seeing? What are they suggesting? What do their comments really mean? You're reading what they say in between the lines. What helped me move more quickly to a positive mindset are two things. One is I had a number of grants where we had to resubmit once or twice, and ultimately they were funded. And if you go back and look at that prior submission, or God forbid, the very first submission, and you read it after long, probably a year has gone by and you're funded, and you look and you say, oh my God, what was I thinking? This thing's terrible. Of course they didn't like it. And you realize that the process of getting reviewed makes the grant better, and your final product is actually quite good, where even you, in hindsight, would judge this first submission harshly. So you see that indeed it will make it better, legitimately. That helps me. And then the other thing that really helped me was becoming a reviewer. It was on top of my day job. It was thankless. It was never the right time. It was always too much. But I really was dedicating myself to helping the enterprise, the research enterprise, and learning quite a lot from doing it. And when I think of myself, I want to give good scores. I want to advocate for these grants. And I think it gives you a different view of stepping in the shoes of your reviewers, knowing that actually they're really on your side. The reviewers like nothing better than to walk into the review and say, let me tell you about a grant that I have, and it's so exciting. Nobody wants to go in and say, mine were no good. So I think the extent to which you can really believe they're on your side and really write with them in mind the whole time, not just with your ideas and your thoughts in mind, but how can you make it good for them? You can really get to a happier place with those rejections.
Well, and this is an example of if your institution has structures to allow pre-review of grants, it can help you. Because again, those individuals who are going to take the time to review your grant are really trying to help you make it better, right? I mean, at the NIH level, they're not really supposed to tell you directly what to do better, but the critiques they make are sort of a pretty direct thing of, hey, it would be better to fix this. And your point about looking back in time at your prior work is not a bad move, because again, what you'll see is the clarity and precision of the language and of the methods, progressively improves. Again, if you think about many grants, let's talk about the career development type grants. If you have a young faculty and you have a strong foundation, meaning good clinical training, done a fellowship, had a couple papers out of fellowship, number of papers in my first couple years of being on faculty, that all deal with a sort of a general topic area, the rating of the candidate often is a 1 or a 2 on that NIH scale of 1 to 9, where 1 or 2 is excellent, really good. So that's often fine. You've done the foundation work, right? But the challenges most often come in the methods part of the approach, and the kind of things where people have trouble is, for example, lack of acknowledgement that there could be problems, right? One proposes a given method, but doesn't have in the text, oh, wait a second, if this doesn't work well, what would I do? That's the limitations or alternative approach section. Similarly, sometimes people don't really haven't really thought deeply enough about the existing literature. And that's another common complaint, or not a critique of, oh, you haven't considered the work in this domain that directly applies to your thing. So there's a number of areas on the method side where you can get in trouble, and the people who are reviewing your thing are going to be quite knowledgeable. There'll be at least one who is pretty much an expert in your area. The other two may wind up being knowledgeable in general, maybe not particularly in your area. But if you're doing health services research and you propose you're doing something that's involving claims in ICD-10 codes, you better be pretty specific about what codes are you talking about. Not, I'll just do ICD-10 codes. You have to be very, very specific, or I'm doing CPT codes on some kind of procedure. And so the specificity on the key elements of your methods, that's often where, again, in a review, you'll get in trouble because people will say, wait a second, what about the exposure time? How, where are you identifying these individuals? And those are like common critiques that people will run across. I think the other thing that's going to be common on the review side is a lack of acknowledgement in the grant of the issues on the analytics side. And on the sample size and power and things like that, that's where working with your statistical colleagues is like critical, because they can really help you to make that part strong, so that that isn't the reason that they don't like your methods.
Right. And just to build off what you're saying, what we have often told grant writers is you cannot hide anything. There is no burying a weakness in the data or the approach or the design, name it. And every study has its strengths and limitations, right? Often there's a section called strengths and limitations, although we prefer not to say limitations, we prefer to say considerations or alternative strategies. However, there's always something that could go wrong. And the extent to which you don't get real with the reviewers about what are you going to do if this variable doesn't have the distribution you want, or if your follow-up doesn't pan out, or if symptoms don't change in the time frame that you've allotted to measure a change, they're going to think you're not serious. And so, in my opinion, you want to take the wind out of their sails by calling something out and getting real about what will you do if. And that is actually a real advantage. I think that everybody recognizes that studies have, easy and hard parts, but they want to see that you're taking this on as a real professional, that you want to achieve something really concrete.
Yeah, it's, I'm trying to think what the right way to express it. You have to demonstrate to the reviewers that you have a deep understanding of the issues related to your scientific problem. That, if the problem were so easily solved that you don't have to think about troubles along the way, then it's not a problem that one should actually be working on, because it's too easy. And so I think, again, we haven't really talked about responding to reviewers, but I think in that domain, probably your best move is pulling out the spreadsheet and having, okay, we have these reviews, and every single comment is put into the spreadsheet. And then you can group them so that they are maybe related to themes, because oftentimes you'll have common themes. There maybe are 3 reviewers, and all 3 of them will say, oh, I worry about this factor in it, or I worry about this. And so that's one where you obviously have to put emphasis when you are going to respond to the reviewer's critique. And by breaking it up into pieces, it actually helps you, because then you start, as opposed to this being a total rejection of you, as a person. It becomes, oh, wait a second, they really wondered about my recruitment strategy. Or someone was concerned about the way in which you were measuring blood pressure, let's say. You weren't doing the blood pressure measurement from the sprint trial, you were doing something else, and would that influence the results of your study? And so I think that actually helps you from a psychological perspective, even if it's a long spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's really great. So we're moving to the responding to reviewer topic for this course. So you like to, when you've sort of gotten past the hurt and you're ready to take the reviews constructively, you get out the reviews and perhaps get out a spreadsheet and start almost coding the reviews for what they say and what the score is, and trying to see if there are similar themes, or, oh no, if the reviewers disagree, that can be challenged. It's an opportunity to sort of pick a winner, or it's a challenge. But often weaknesses are recognized by multiple people, and those are the most important things to respond to. So you put it in there, and then I think you have the words. What did they say? What did they score? Okay, we can take those seriously. And there's reading between the lines, right? So as you say, if you've done your preparatory work, you might get a great score as an individual. How wonderful. And you have an amazing mentorship team. And shockingly, this amazing mentorship team gets some questionable scores. And you think, well, now, do I have to fire one of my mentors? Do I have to change the team? What am I doing? That may not be something to take literally. Actually, they were all really upset with some kind of approach in the analysis plan. And really what they did was they dinged you on that, but they really hit the mentors hard, because they said, if this team was on the ball, if this team was paying attention to this person, no mentor would have allowed this analysis plan to come to the light of day. And so you kind of you pay twice, sort of. You get hit in two places. They don't dislike your team. They're giving you a signal that they did not expect what they read in this analysis plan. So that's where we sort of read the tea leaves also, right?
Well, and again, get back to what we talked about with timing earlier on. This is one reason why you have to allow a lot of time for you're getting your submission ready. Now, just because you've given yourself 6 months for the submission doesn't mean that you don't manage your mentors. Okay, meaning you need like honest to goodness feedback from them. It's not enough for them to say, this looks good, right? Because then you wind up with the kind of critique that you just had, where you have some world-leading scientist who's your mentor, and the reviewers say, how could you possibly have picked method X to do this when everyone knows that that's a flawed method? And so in terms of the managing up, what it really means is you have to work with your mentors. You have to give them concrete tasks. Most of them are super busy, right? But you have to give them a timeline for response. And if you have a mentor who won't give you useful feedback, that's a bit of a problem. And again, sometimes it happens. So for example, I have a mentor where there's a family issue and the mentor can't help now. That mentor better help on the resubmission in a real way. If they don't or aren't able to help on the resubmission, then probably you need to rethink your team a little bit, and maybe that person should not play as big a role in it as you had originally planned, because that's their job, right? Their job.
Right. And speaking of whose job is what, I do think we've seen some of the novice researchers moving out of, postdoc or fellowship era, switching over to assistant professor phase, where they are the one doing the pushing. They're the ones doing the managing. They're the ones managing the timeline. Whereas in a more training type environment, they might expect that the mentor's telling them what to do, what timeline, what is due, the mentor's asking for or taking quite a heavy hand in the content. Whereas even shifting onto faculty, you're much more a free agent. And you have got to get that feedback from the mentor. So as you say, it's managing up, but it's on you as the investigator. It's actually not your mentor's job to tell you what to do.
Well, in your training period, you're lucky if your mentor actually helps guide you that way, right? Hey, we got to do this now. This needs to be next. This is the product. All of that. Now, once you're out of that mode, again, now you're on your own, right?
Right.
You're no longer, just coddled in the situation. But again, that's where it is important to make it clear to people what you need to help you push forward on the response things. And again, depends on what the nature of the response is, or the critiques are, how you respond to them. The other thing I would say is you cannot accept every critique and just do what is the natural thing for all critiques, because then what happens is you start like being a weather vane, right? Oh, someone told me to do this, so I'll do that. And then someone said, no, don't do this. And so this is where, again, your understanding of your scientific question, your idea, where am I going, it needs to be like a North Star for you, so that you can take people's comments, consider them, and say, okay, which are the ones that that really helps me on this? Which one is one that pushes me off away from what I really want to do? And those you can't just respond to everything, I guess is what I would say.
Yes. Yes. So true. So true. And, there, as you said, there's a productive level of stubborn in most researchers where, you just know what the right answer is and, you're just going to keep going. And there's got to be a coachability and openness to seeing a different way. And so there is also an art and a science to writing the response and basically agreeing and being grateful, and maybe you make a change, maybe you don't. So it's a little bit like responding on a manuscript. I would always start a response with, we agree, even if in agreement, we do not change anything. So yes, you have to be very judicious. And literally, we often suggest that people open that response to reviewers with, remind the reviewers of all the things they liked. I mean, it wasn't a total loss, right? There were things they liked. Put those up front and then go after the changes strictly with a positive valence. We have a rule for this, right, Allan?
Yes. Well, it's called the Berman Principle, after one of our colleagues, Brian Berman, who's now in Virginia. And his comment, especially on the Ames page and on the response to reviewers, is no negativity. Okay, so to start off by saying, well, the reviewers gave pretty serious critiques to these three aspects of the grant, it's not the way to lead in. That's not the way to lead in. As you alluded to, is the reviewers really thought this was a critically important topic, and they really liked X, Y, and Z, and they gave very useful feedback.
Right.
That we have, and then you say, and I, with my mentorship team, have, developed these responses to it, and so instead of like on your one-page response in the NIH, instead of saying critique one,
right, too muddled, you say we providing clarification on,
or we've expanded.
Right, it's only with a positive valence. Yes. Yeah. Positivity in all things.
And that runs through the rest of the grant as well, because sometimes people will have comments like, well, in my pilot study we had a bit of a signal early on and then it faded away. Well, that doesn't make someone think, oh, you've got a great idea. And so can one reframe it? So in our small pilot study, or I shouldn't even use the word small,
Yeah.
in our pilot study, we saw a clinically relevant effect at 1 month.
True.
True. And
True.
how much you say about the longer term, but then you say, however, longer term and larger scale studies are going to be needed to confirm the magnitude of this effect going forward.
Yes, indeed, indeed. Yes, so, targeted, positive. The other thing we could talk about is we often ask people to do a few additional things, and this might even take them, they might need an extra cycle to resubmit. If there are some real questions raised that could be answered by additional pilot data or an actual peer-reviewed publication at a minimum under review, better to be accepted or in press. Some products of scholarship with the team to show that this team can get things done together, or other things like evidence that there's a law that's going to be passed that's going to change the system that makes it quite urgent to get this done. So could we talk a little bit about, what other things besides grantsmanship, wordsmithing, can people do to boost this resubmission?
Well, there are two aspects to what you just said. One is a timing question. So do I resubmit on the very next possible cycle or not? And that really depends on the nature of the critiques that you've received. So if some of the critiques relate to, well, you have not published, let's say we're in a career development context, you have not published with your mentorship team, well, your ability to turn that around by the next cycle is going to be really limited, because unless that paper is already out the door, you're not going to be able to get another paper out and get this resubmitted, which probably means you have to wait at least one cycle, again, using the NIH timeline.
Or we might even say, submit an abstract to a meeting, get something with your team's name on it that will, if you do all the right things, turn into a publication or get the actual publication.
Right. So again, as one looks at the critiques, sometimes you get critiques. This is particularly when the score is a good score, but not quite at the fundable level, where really what it is it's massaging what you have sent in before, maybe addressing limitations or considerations, or maybe adding some elements or shortening the duration of follow-up or whatever it might be. Those are things that can be done by the next cycle in many cases, because they're not really telling you to lay a new foundation. They're not really telling you we need more pilot data or more papers. They're telling you there are certain aspects of the methods, for example, that can be optimized or improved. And so then you can get that in faster than you could if you have to add more foundation stones.
Agree. The one caveat I think we should raise is that sometimes people, it's a lot of work to resubmit. They're still a little conflicted with some of the advice. And they say, well, I'm going to put off this resubmission so I can write more papers. But by gosh, that time just flies right along. And there are no more papers, or not enough papers to have justified a 6-month break. So I think if that's the strategy, you have got to get really honest with yourself about what will be achieved, calendar it out, and those milestones should be treated as seriously as a resubmission milestone. Because it's easy to get really motivated when the federal government says what the due date is. And when it's just like, how are you going to work this into your life? You might be a little more generous with your time. So I think we should be quite careful with what is of sufficient importance that it would slow down a resubmission at the next cycle.
Well, I've used the term relentless. Again, if your interest and the importance of your scientific idea is really, really strong, then when you go after a grant or whether you say I have to do papers, that is your priority, right? You don't, in terms of calendaring it out, you don't substitute something else for this if that's the number one priority. And again, this gets back to why are you doing it in the first place? If the problem, I'll speak from the point of view of clinicians. Many times clinicians are trying to fix something that they see every day in their clinical practice that is bugging them, that it's bad for patients, and that they must answer this question to help their patients and make things better for them. And if you must answer the question, then you're not going to put off writing the paper that needs to be done for the resubmission, because there's this intense drive. And of course, if you look back in history on people who are outstanding scientists, the ones I've worked with several over the years, they have a goal and they ask themselves, what do I need to achieve this goal? And if I need to do this, I'm going to do it. If it means I have to write a paper, I'm going to do it. If it means I have to learn a new technique, I'm going to do it. If I need to have a different mentor, I'm going to find one. And again, one wants to have a reason to be doing all this work. And it's a massive job getting a grant. And so it gets back to your inner motivation for this. So
yeah, find your why.
Right.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Allan.
Oh, you're more than welcome.